Excuse me, could I please try playing the piano for just a moment? Richard Hartwell's eyebrows raised in mild annoyance. I'm sorry, but this piano isn't for public use. His voice sharpened as he took in her appearance. This is a private event, sweetheart. You clearly don't belong here. Now his tone turned vicious, loud enough for everyone to hear. Security should have stopped you at the door. Go find whatever adult dragged you in here and leave before you make an even bigger fool of yourself. The crowd of wealthy donors laughed, phones recording her humiliation. Designer dresses rustled with whispered mockery. Crystal glasses clinked in cruel celebration. No one defended her, but none of them could imagine what was about to happen in the next few minutes. How the very man mocking her would soon be the one begging for forgiveness. The morning sun struggled through grimy windows into the cramped apartment above Murphy's laundromat on Detroit's East Side. 12-year-old Zara Williams sat cross-legged on the threadbare carpet, her fingers dancing across a piece of cardboard marked with hand-drawn piano keys. The real keyboard, a battered Casio with half the keys missing, had died 3 weeks ago when the power adapter finally gave up. The smell of industrial detergent, mixed with her grandmother Rosa's lavender lotion, drifted up through the floorboards. Washing machines churned endlessly below, their rhythmic thumping creating an odd percussion for Zara's silent practice. She pressed the paper keys with careful precision, her lips moving as she counted beats, her body swaying to music only she could hear. Ballade number 1, G minor, she whispered, closing her eyes. Her fingers found every imaginary note of Chopin's masterpiece, muscle memory built from countless hours when the keyboard still worked. The piece was impossibly difficult. Most conservatory students couldn't master it, but Zara had learned it note by note, watching YouTube videos on Rosa's cracked phone, rewinding each section until her fingers memorized every nuance. Rosa Williams shuffled from the tiny kitchen, her chemotherapy-weakened frame wrapped in a pink bathrobe that had seen better decades. At 68, she moved like someone carrying the weight of 2 lifetimes. Her dark eyes, though tired, still sparkled when she watched her granddaughter practice. Playing Chopin again, baby girl? Zara looked up, her face lighting despite their circumstances. I can almost hear it, Grandma. The way it's supposed to sound. Rosa lowered herself onto the second-hand couch, wincing as her joints protested. The eviction notice on the coffee table seemed to mock them both, bold red letters demanding 3 months' back rent they didn't have. Next to it lay medical bills that might as well have been written in foreign currency for all the hope they had of paying them. Tell me about the music, Rosa said softly. Help me hear what you hear. Zara's hands moved across the cardboard keys as she spoke. It starts sad, like someone remembering something beautiful they lost. Then it gets angry, fighting against the sadness. But in the middle, she paused, her fingers finding a particularly complex passage. In the middle it becomes something else, like hope refusing to die. Rosa's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. 3 months ago, she'd been scrubbing floors at the Hartwell Arts Foundation, barely making enough to keep food on the table. Then she'd asked for time off for her cancer treatments. Richard Hartwell himself had fired her the next day, claiming she was unreliable and setting a poor example for other staff. The broken keyboard in the corner told its own story. Rosa had found it at Goodwill for $20, money that should have gone toward groceries. But when she'd seen Zara's face light up at the sight of actual keys, real sounds, she couldn't leave it behind. That night, she'd quietly pawned her mother's engagement ring to buy it. Grandma, Zara said suddenly, what if I audition for the Detroit Music Academy? Mrs. Lane at school says they give scholarships. Rosa's heart clenched. The application fee alone was $500, money they'd never see. But she wouldn't crush her granddaughter's dreams with reality. Not yet. Maybe we'll find a way, she said instead. The apartment told the story of their struggle in every corner. Furniture that didn't match, rescued from curbs and thrift stores, a refrigerator that hummed too loudly and kept nothing truly cold, textbooks held together with tape because buying new ones was impossible. But everywhere, small touches revealed their unbreakable bond. Family photos in dollar store frames, Rosa's hand-knitted blankets, drawings Zara had made of musicians she admired. On the windowsill sat their most precious possession, a faded photograph of Zara's great-grandmother Billy, standing beside a piano in some long-closed Harlem jazz club. Rosa had told Zara the stories countless times, how Billy could make a piano weep or laugh, how she'd played for presidents and paupers alike, how segregation had kept her from the recognition she deserved. "Music chooses its vessel, baby girl," Rosa had whispered on countless nights when Zara felt discouraged. "Don't let poverty silence what God put in you." Now, watching her granddaughter practice on cardboard, Rosa felt that familiar ache in her chest. Zara had inherited Billy's gift, maybe even surpassed it. But talent without opportunity was just heartbreak, waiting to happen. The sound of coins dropping in washing machines below created an oddly comforting rhythm. This had been their soundtrack for 3 years, ever since Zara's mother had moved to Chicago for work, promising to send for them when she got settled. The promises had faded to monthly phone calls, then holiday cards, then silence. Zara's father had disappeared when she was 5, leaving behind only vague memories of bedtime stories and the scent of aftershave. But Rosa had been enough. Grandmother, mother, teacher, and cheerleader all in one. She'd worked double shifts cleaning office buildings so Zara could focus on school. She'd saved every penny so Zara could have music lessons, even if they came from YouTube instead of conservatory teachers. "I dreamed about Carnegie Hall again," Zara said quietly, her hands still moving across the cardboard. "I was wearing a real dress, playing a real piano. The whole audience was crying." "Dreams are just tomorrow's reality wearing yesterday's clothes," Rosa replied, using one of her favorite sayings. "Don't you ever stop dreaming." The afternoon sun shifted, casting longer shadows across their small sanctuary. Soon Rosa would need to rest. The chemotherapy left her exhausted by evening, and Zara would return to her homework, spreading textbooks across the same table where they ate generic cereal for dinner and counted pills for Rosa's treatment. But for this moment, grandmother and granddaughter existed in perfect harmony. Rosa hummed softly while Zara's fingers found melodies in silence, both of them believing that somehow, someday, the music would find a way to save them. Outside, Detroit hummed with its own rough symphony, sirens and traffic, construction and conversation. Their neighborhood bore the scars of economic hardship, but it also pulsed with resilience. Families like theirs, holding together through love and stubborn hope, refusing to let circumstances define their worth. Neither of them knew that tomorrow's charity event would change everything. Zara's cardboard practice was preparing her for the performance of her lifetime. That Rosa's faith in her granddaughter's gift would finally be vindicated in the most spectacular way imaginable. For now, they simply existed in their small bubble of love and music, where dreams lived on borrowed time and talent waited patiently for its moment to shine. Richard Hartwell moved through the marble corridors of his arts foundation like a king surveying his domain. At 58, he had perfected the art of commanding attention without saying a word. His charcoal Armani suit cost more than most people's monthly salary. Sterling silver cufflinks caught the crystal chandelier light as he adjusted them with practiced precision. The Hartwell Arts Foundation's annual gala represented everything he had built: wealth, influence, and the intoxicating power of controlling other people's dreams. Tonight's fundraiser promised to raise over $2 million, money that would flow through carefully selected programs designed to enhance his reputation. "Mr. Hartwell, the Times photographer is here," his assistant Miranda whispered, clutching her tablet like armor. She had learned to anticipate his moods, to speak only when spoken to disappear when his temper flared. "Good." Make sure they capture me with the scholarship recipients. I want to look generous, not condescending. Behind him trailed his usual entourage, lawyer James Morrison, whose job was ensuring every donation came with maximum tax benefits. Society photographer Catherine Wells paid handsomely to document his benevolence. And Foundation Director Dr. Elizabeth Vaughn, whose Harvard credentials lent academic weight to his initiatives. The Great Hall buzzed with Detroit's elite. Auto executives mingled with tech entrepreneurs. Old money families traded gossip with new money climbers. Everyone here belonged to a world where access required approval, where Richard Hartwell served as gatekeeper and judge. He paused before a wall displaying scholarship recipients' photographs. Young faces smiled back, carefully selected students whose success stories made compelling fundraising materials, each chosen not just for talent, but for their ability to represent his mission without challenging fundamental assumptions. "Sir," James approached with reports, "the scholarship committee recommends the usual profile, middle-class students with strong academics and minimal financial need." Richard nodded approvingly. True poverty was messy, unpredictable. These children came with complications: unstable housing, family crises, chaos that reflected poorly on institutional photographs. Better to help those already halfway to success. His philosophy had crystallized over business decades. People were investments. Some carried inherent value: proper breeding, stable families, social connections. Others were liabilities waiting to happen. His job was maximizing returns while minimizing risks. "Could you pose with the Steinway?" Catherine positioned her camera strategically. "The lighting is perfect." He moved toward the magnificent piano dominating the hall's center. The 1970 Steinway Model D had cost $300,000, but it served its purpose beautifully. Guests always commented on its elegance, its pristine condition, the way it symbolized the Foundation's commitment to excellence. As he approached, his expression darkened. A small figure sat on the bench, fingers hovering over keys without touching them. The girl wore thrift store clothes, a faded dress that might have been blue once, scuffed sneakers with duct tape holding the sole to the shoe. "Excuse me." His voice carried the authority of someone unaccustomed to being ignored. "This piano is not for public use." The girl turned. Richard's irritation deepened. She was perhaps 12, obviously black, obviously poor. Her presence violated every unspoken rule of his carefully curated event. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I just wanted to see it up close." Something about her voice nagged at him. Then recognition struck. This was Rosa Williams's granddaughter, the cleaning woman he'd fired for requesting cancer treatment time off. Rosa had argued with him, claimed she had rights, threatened to contact a lawyer she couldn't afford. A slow smile spread across Richard's face. The universe had provided a perfect opportunity to reinforce important lessons. "Well, well," he said, voice carrying across the hall. "If it isn't little Zara Williams, I remember you." Conversations faded as heads turned toward the piano. Richard felt the familiar thrill of controlling a room's attention. This unexpected encounter could serve multiple purposes: entertainment for guests, a teachable moment about knowing one's place, and a reminder why his foundation maintained such careful standards. "Your grandmother used to work here," he continued, ensuring his words reached every corner, before she decided her personal problems were more important than professional responsibilities. The girl's shoulders tensed, but she didn't respond. Her silence fueled his confidence. Miranda shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the dangerous gleam in her boss's eyes. Catherine raised her camera, sensing a story unfolding. James checked his phone, already crafting justifying narratives. "Tell me, Zara." Richard savored the girl's obvious discomfort. "What brings you to an event so clearly above your station? Surely you understand this gathering is for people who've earned their place in society." The crowd formed a loose circle, phones emerging from designer purses. This impromptu entertainment was far more interesting than boring donation speeches. Richard felt the familiar rush of absolute power. In his world, he decided who belonged and who didn't, who deserved opportunities and who needed to learn limitations. Tonight, he would provide this girl, and anyone watching, with a lesson they'd never forget. The stage was perfectly set for what would come next. The crystal chandeliers seemed to dim as every conversation in the grand hall gradually died away. 200 of Detroit's most influential citizens formed a widening circle around the Steinway piano, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. The only sounds were the soft whisper of designer fabric and the distant hum of air conditioning. Richard Hartwell stepped closer to Zara, his polished Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble with deliberate authority. Each step was calculated to build tension, to remind everyone present exactly who controlled this room and everything in it. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed across the hall with practiced theatrical flair, "it seems we have an unexpected guest tonight. Young Zara here appears to believe she belongs among Detroit's cultural elite." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Phone cameras emerged from Hermes purses and Armani jacket pockets. Social media notifications would be buzzing within minutes. The city's power brokers leaned forward, sensing drama unfolding before their eyes. Zara remained motionless on the piano bench, her small frame dwarfed by the massive instrument. Her grandmother Rosa had taught her to be invisible in spaces like this, to clean quietly around important people without drawing attention. But there was nowhere to hide now. "This magnificent Steinway," Richard continued, running his manicured fingers along the piano's polished surface, "represents everything our foundation stands for: excellence, precision, standards." His eyes fixed on Zara with predatory intensity. "Standards that some people simply cannot meet." Miranda clutched her tablet tighter, her knuckles white with tension. She had seen her boss destroy people before, always with the same calculated cruelty disguised as moral instruction. Dr. Vaughn studied the floor, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. James Morrison smiled slightly, already crafting the press release that would frame this encounter as educational outreach. "But I'm feeling generous tonight." Richard's voice took on a mock-charitable tone that made several guests shift uncomfortably. "Tell you what, Zara, since you seem so fascinated by this piano, why don't you play something for our distinguished guests?" The suggestion hung in the air like poison gas. Zara's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the bench. She had dreamed of playing a real piano countless times, but never like this. Never as entertainment for people who saw her as a curiosity. "Play this piano like you mean it," Richard's voice grew louder, ensuring every guest could hear clearly. "And if you can move even one person in this room, truly move them, I'll personally fund your entire education." Murmurs of surprise swept through the crowd. Several guests exchanged glances, uncertain whether to be impressed by the offer or horrified by the spectacle. "But when you fail," Richard's tone hardened like steel, "when you prove that talent requires more than wishful thinking, I want you to admit something. Admit that dreams without pedigree are just delusions. Admit that your grandmother's faith in you was nothing but misplaced hope." The cruelty of his words hit Zara like a physical blow. Around the circle, guests began to fidget. Some looked genuinely uncomfortable with the public humiliation unfolding before them, but none spoke up. This was Richard Hartwell's domain, and challenging him meant risking their own social standing. "In fact," Richard pressed his advantage, savoring the girl's obvious distress, "play this piano and prove you're not completely worthless, and I'll adopt you myself. God knows you need saving from whatever situation you crawled out of." Gasps echoed through the hall. Even by Richard's standards, this was breathtakingly cruel. Catherine's camera clicked rapidly, capturing every moment of the girl's humiliation for posterity. Zara felt the weight of 200 stares pressing down on her shoulders. Every face in the circle belonged to someone who could change her life with a phone call, someone who controlled opportunities she could only dream about. They watched her struggle with the detached interest of spectators at a gladiator match. "What do you say, little girl?" Richard leaned down, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the hall. "Ready to prove your grandmother's investment was worth something? Or will you run back to whatever hovel you came from?" The piano bench felt like it was burning beneath her. Zara's throat was so tight she could barely breathe. Part of her wanted to flee, to escape this nightmare of public humiliation and never look back. These people would forget her by tomorrow, moving on to their next entertainment. But something deeper stirred in her chest. She thought of Rosa, fighting cancer while working double shifts to pay for Zara's music lessons. She thought of great-grandmother Billy, playing jazz in Harlem clubs where talent meant more than skin color. She thought of all the hours spent practicing on cardboard keys, preparing for a moment that might never come. "Do you dare?" Richard's voice rose to a crescendo. "If you dare, can you actually pull it off? Or will you prove once and for all that some people simply don't belong in places like this?" The challenge hung in the perfumed air like a blade waiting to fall. 200 hearts beat in anticipation. 200 phones recorded every second. And one 12-year-old girl sat at a piano worth more than her family's entire life, facing the most important decision she would ever make. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Zara's heart hammered against her ribs as 200 pairs of eyes bore into her. The weight of their stares pressed her down into the piano bench until she thought she might disappear entirely. Richard Hartwell's cruel smile widened as he watched her struggle. He had seen this moment countless times, the instant when people realized they were drowning in waters too deep. Soon she would mumble an excuse and flee, providing his guests with satisfying entertainment. But then Zara closed her eyes. In the darkness, she heard Rosa's voice from that morning. "Music chooses its vessel, baby girl. Don't let poverty silence what God put in you." She remembered Rosa's stories about great-grandmother Billy, who played in Harlem clubs where talent commanded respect, even when the world refused to see her worth. "Our music lives in our blood," Rosa always whispered during cardboard practice sessions. "It doesn't care about your address or bank account. It only cares about your soul." Zara's breathing slowly steadied. She thought of Rosa counting pills and medical bills with fingers roughened by decades of cleaning. She thought of the eviction notice, the broken keyboard, the scholarship fee they could never afford. What did she have to lose that hadn't already been taken? Her eyes opened. Something fundamental had changed. Her spine straightened against the piano bench. Her chin lifted with quiet determination. The trembling in her hands stilled into perfect calm. She turned to face Richard Hartwell directly, her young voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall. "Mr. Hartwell, I'll play." The words came out steady and sure. "But when I'm done, you'll understand why my grandmother never needed your validation." A ripple of surprise swept through the crowd. This wasn't the cowering retreat they had expected. Several guests leaned forward, suddenly interested in something more than social gossip. Miranda's eyes widened behind her tablet. Dr. Vaughn looked up from the floor for the first time all evening. Even James Morrison stopped checking his phone, sensing something unexpected about to unfold. Richard's confident smile faltered before reasserting itself. "How delightful. I do enjoy watching people learn important lessons about their limitations." But Zara was no longer listening. She had turned back to the piano, small hands hovering over pristine ivory keys. For 12 years, she had dreamed of this moment. Not the cruel circumstances, but the chance to let her music speak when words failed. The Steinway waited beneath her fingers like a sleeping giant, holding within its strings the power to transform everything. In the hushed expectation of the grand hall, with cameras recording and reputations hanging in balance, One small girl prepared to show the world what courage sounded like. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't money or status. It's simply the courage to show who you really are when everything is at stake. Zara's fingers touched the keys, and the world held its breath. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor emerged like whispered secrets, tentative and fragile. Her hands trembled slightly as muscle memory fought against the overwhelming pressure of 200 judgmental stares. The piano's voice was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Rich, resonant, alive beneath her touch in ways her broken Casio could never be. Each key responded with perfect weight and balance, the Steinway's legendary craftsmanship revealing itself through her inexperienced but devoted fingers. Richard Hartwell checked his Rolex with theatrical impatience, his smirk growing wider as the opening phrases wavered. Around the circle, guests shifted restlessly in their designer shoes and tailored suits. Some had already returned to checking their phones, assuming the spectacle would end quickly with the girl's inevitable failure. Dr. Vaughn examined her manicured nails with studied indifference. James Morrison typed rapid notes on his phone, already crafting tomorrow's damage control narrative about the evening's unfortunate incident. "Poor child," whispered Mrs. Wellington to her husband, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light. "This is almost cruel to watch. Someone should stop this before it becomes completely humiliating." Her husband nodded absently, already thinking about tomorrow's golf appointment. The other guests murmured similar sentiments, polite expressions of concern that barely masked their anticipation of watching someone fail so publicly and completely. But then, something began to change. Zara's posture straightened as the melody found its footing. Her shoulders relaxed despite the pressure, her breathing deepened into the rhythm Rosa had taught her, and the tentative notes grew stronger with each passing measure. The opening theme of the ballade, Chopin's meditation on longing and loss, began to fill the marble hall with surprising authority. The uncertainty that had marked her first moments vanished, replaced by something much more dangerous, confidence born from years of silent practice and unshakable belief. Miranda lowered her tablet, drawn in despite her professional obligation to document her boss's triumph. The music wasn't just technically correct. It was speaking in a language she hadn't heard since childhood piano lessons with her grandmother. Each phrase carried emotional weight that seemed impossible from someone so young, so obviously disadvantaged. The notes weren't merely being played, they were being lived, breathed, felt, with an intensity that made the very air seem to vibrate with meaning. Is she actually? Dr. Vaughn's academic skepticism began to crack as she recognized the sophisticated interpretation unfolding before them. This wasn't the fumbling of an amateur struggling with material beyond her comprehension. This was artistry announcing itself to a world that had refused to listen, talent demanding recognition regardless of its humble origins. 30 seconds in, and the crowd's restless energy started to shift like a tide changing direction. Conversations died mid-sentence as Ballade's narrative began to unfold with unexpected sophistication. Phone cameras that had been recording for social media mockery suddenly became serious documentation of something none of them had expected to witness. The guests found themselves leaning forward unconsciously, no longer watching a public humiliation, but witnessing something they couldn't quite name yet, but knew was important. Zara's interpretation revealed layers that most conservatory students never discovered in years of formal study. Where technique should have been mechanical and careful, it flowed like water over stones, natural and inevitable. Where emotion could have been manufactured for effect, it poured from some deep well of authentic experience, lived rather than studied. Each phrase spoke of Rosa's quiet strength in the face of cancer and poverty, of dreams deferred but never abandoned, of love persisting through circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. Judge Morrison found himself remembering his own childhood piano lessons, abandoned when law school demanded his complete attention and childhood dreams seemed like luxuries he couldn't afford. The music awakened something in him he thought had died decades ago, The pure, uncomplicated joy of beautiful sound created by human hands and heart, working in perfect harmony, unmarked by commercial considerations or social expectations. Richard's smirk began to waver like a candle in an unexpected wind. This wasn't the embarrassing failure he had orchestrated for his guests' amusement and his own ego gratification. The girl was actually playing, not just correctly, but with a sophistication and emotional depth that made his own foundation's carefully selected scholarship recipients sound like beginners reading sheet music for the first time, technically proficient but artistically vacant. 1 minute in, and the room had transformed completely from a social gathering into something approaching a religious experience. The ballade's more complex passages emerged with crystalline clarity that defied physics and logic. Zara's small hands moved across the keyboard with impossible grace, finding every note of Chopin's intricate architecture while somehow making it look effortless, as natural as breathing. Her cheap dress and worn sneakers became irrelevant details as the music revealed the true artist within, stripping away external circumstances to expose pure talent in its most powerful form. "My God," breathed Maestro Giuliani, who had been conducting the Detroit Symphony for 3 decades and thought he had heard everything the classical repertoire could offer. "She's not just playing the notes, she's rewriting them, finding meanings that the composers themselves might not have known were there." He pushed through the crowd with growing urgency, his trained ear recognizing something extraordinary happening in real time. Catherine's camera clicked rapidly, her professional instincts screaming that she was documenting a moment that would define careers, change lives, possibly reshape how the entire city thought about talent and opportunity and the places where genius could be found. This wasn't just a talented child playing piano. This was raw genius announcing itself to a world that had tried to silence it through prejudice and economic barriers. The technical demands of the piece would challenge graduate students at Juilliard, conservatory-trained musicians who had spent years perfecting their technique under the guidance of world-class instructors. But Zara navigated them as if she had been born for this moment, as if Chopin himself was guiding her fingers across keys he had never touched, but would have recognized as perfectly suited to his musical vision. Her interpretation began to incorporate subtle jazz influences that shouldn't have worked, but created something entirely new and beautiful. Echoes of great-grandmother Billy's Harlem legacy wove through Chopin's classical structure like golden threads through expensive fabric, creating a musical conversation across generations and genres that created its own vocabulary of beauty and meaning. "She's channeling something," whispered Catherine to no one in particular, her camera capturing every nuance of a performance that was becoming historic with each passing measure. "This isn't performance in any traditional sense. This is possession, communication with something beyond normal human experience." 90 seconds in, and tears appeared on faces throughout the crowd like morning dew on expensive fabric. Mrs. Wellington, wife of the automotive fortune and patron of countless cultural institutions, dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief her grandmother had brought from Ireland, no longer caring about her carefully applied makeup or social appearances. Her husband gripped her hand with surprising intensity, both of them transported back to their own wedding day 40 years ago, when they had danced to Chopin in a world that seemed infinitely more hopeful and full of possibility. Judge Morrison found his throat tight with emotion he couldn't name and didn't want to analyze too closely. The music was telling stories he had forgotten he knew, stories of struggle and triumph that belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated, who had ever been told their dreams were too big for their circumstances, who had ever been judged by external appearances rather than internal worth. Even the catering staff stopped serving completely, drawn to the edge of the circle by sounds they had never heard before, despite working hundreds of similar events. Busboys and waitresses stood mesmerized, their own dreams of artistic expression awakened by this small girl's fearless display of authentic talent, unleashed without apology or compromise. Richard's champagne glass trembled in his grip as his carefully constructed worldview began to crumble like ancient parchment exposed to sudden light. This couldn't be happening according to every belief system he had built his life around. Street children didn't play like this. With this level of sophistication, this emotional depth, this technical mastery that surpassed anything his foundation had ever produced through proper channels and expensive instruction. 2 minutes in, and the ballade reached its most challenging section, the passage that separated true virtuosos from merely competent players. Conservatory professors used this section to humble overeager students who thought talent alone was sufficient for greatness. Professional pianists approached it with respect bordering on fear, knowing that technical perfection here required not just skill, but courage. The room held its collective breath as Zara approached the technical and emotional summit of the piece that had defeated countless better-trained musicians. Her fingers paused for one heart-stopping moment above the keys, and the silence stretched like a tightrope over an abyss of possibility and failure. Richard's smile began to return with growing confidence. Surely this was where the girl would falter, where reality would reassert itself over this impossible dream, where the natural order of things would be restored and his assumptions validated. Then her fingers exploded across the keys with devastating precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics and musical possibility. The climactic passage poured from the Steinway like liquid fire, each note perfectly placed yet burning with emotional truth that transcended mere technical execution. This wasn't just performance. This was prophecy, revelation, the universe speaking through a 12-year-old girl who had learned music on cardboard keys and practiced in poverty, but never let circumstances diminish the gift burning within her soul like an eternal flame. The crowd gasped audibly, a sound like collective awakening from a dream they hadn't realized they were living. Several guests openly wept, their social masks dissolving in the face of something so pure and powerful it demanded authentic response rather than polite appreciation. The music was rewriting the very air around them, transforming the sterile perfection of the fundraiser into something sacred and alive and completely beyond their previous experience. The final chord of Chopin's ballade hung in the air like a prayer answered by heaven itself. For 3 heartbeats that felt like eternity, absolute silence filled the grand hall. 200 souls stood frozen in the aftermath of witnessing something that had fundamentally changed them, something that would replay in their minds for years to come. Then Maestro Giuliani began to clap. His applause started slowly, deliberately, each strike of his weathered hands carrying the weight of 3 decades conducting the world's finest musicians. Within seconds, the sound multiplied exponentially as the entire crowd erupted into thunderous recognition. This wasn't the polite appreciation of social obligation. This was the raw, desperate applause of people who had just witnessed a miracle and needed to express something their vocabulary couldn't contain. The standing ovation built like a tsunami of sound. Crystal chandeliers seemed to vibrate with the force of 200 people clapping, cheering, wiping away tears they hadn't realized they were shedding. Designer shoes shuffled against marble as Detroit's elite forgot their carefully maintained composure and surrendered to pure, honest emotion. Magnificent! Maestro Giuliani pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down his face without shame or apology. Young lady, I have conducted at Carnegie Hall, at La Scala, at the Vienna State Opera. What you just played, that wasn't a performance. That was a prophecy. Mrs. Wellington clutched her husband's arm, her voice breaking with emotion. In 40 years of attending concerts, I have never heard anything like that. She didn't just play the music. She became one. Richard Hartwell stood paralyzed in the center of the chaos, his face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and something approaching horror. The champagne glass lay shattered at his feet, forgotten fragments reflecting the overhead lights like his broken assumptions about worth and talent. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, as if his brain couldn't process commands for speech. Zara remained seated at the piano bench, her small hands still resting on the keys, scarcely believing what had just erupted around her. The Steinway felt warm beneath her fingers, as if it too had been transformed by their musical conversation. For 12 years, she had dreamed of this recognition, but the reality overwhelmed every fantasy. Phone cameras flashed frantically as social media exploded with footage of the performance. Within minutes, #Detroit Piano Girl was trending across platforms as videos spread through networks of people who understood they had just witnessed something historic. "Sir?" Miranda approached Richard with visible concern, her tablet forgotten in her hands. "Sir? Are you all right?" Richard's eyes remained fixed on Zara, watching as Maestro Giuliani knelt beside the piano bench to speak with her at eye level. The man who had built an empire by judging people's worth was confronting the complete collapse of his judgment system. Dr. Vaughn pushed through the crowd, her academic reserve completely abandoned. "This child needs proper training immediately. We're looking at once-in-a-generation talent here. Perhaps once in a century." Catherine's camera clicked rapidly, capturing every moment of the transformation happening in real time. "This is going to be on the front page of every major publication in the country," she said breathlessly. "Hell, this is going international." James Morrison stood slack-jawed, his legal mind struggling to process the implications of what his boss had just orchestrated. The public humiliation had backfired so spectacularly that damage control seemed impossible. Worse, it had been filmed by dozens of phones and would live forever on the internet. The crowd began to surge toward Zara, but Maestro Giuliani held up his hands protectively. "Please, give her space. She needs a moment to process what just happened." Rosa Williams appeared at the edge of the circle, having watched the entire performance from the lobby doorway. Her face glowed with pride so intense it seemed to light the room. She had known this moment would come someday, not the cruel circumstances, but the recognition her granddaughter deserved. Finally, Richard found his voice. He stepped forward through the parting crowd, his usual commanding presence reduced to something small and uncertain. The man who moments before had held absolute social power now approached a 12-year-old girl like a supplicant seeking forgiveness. He began, then stopped, his throat constricting with unfamiliar emotions. "I owe you an apology." Zara stood slowly, smoothing her simple dress with dignity that made her worn clothes seem irrelevant. She looked directly at Richard Hartwell, meeting his eyes with quiet strength that belonged to someone far older than 12. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed crowd, "music doesn't need your money to exist, but maybe your money needs music to mean something." The mic drop moment hung in the perfumed air like a blade of truth cutting through decades of pretension. The crowd fell silent again, recognizing the perfect precision of her response. She had turned his own cruelty into wisdom, his humiliation into education, his power into irrelevance. Richard's face crumpled as the full weight of his actions crashed over him. This child, this extraordinary gifted child, had just shown him what he had become in his pursuit of wealth and status, and she had done it with grace he didn't deserve. The transformation that followed happened so quickly it seemed like magic, but it was the kind of magic that only truth can create when it finally breaks through years of willful blindness. Maestro Giuliani was the first to step forward with concrete action. His weathered hands shook slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card, but his voice carried absolute certainty. "Miss Williams, the Detroit Music Academy has a full scholarship program that I personally oversee. Consider yourself our newest recipient, effective immediately." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The Detroit Music Academy was legendary, a pipeline to Juilliard, Curtis, the world's most prestigious conservatories. Students waited years for audition opportunities that Zara had just earned with 4 minutes of transcendent music. "Furthermore," Maestro Giuliani continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I will personally arrange for you to study with Professor Helena Kozlova at the University of Michigan. She trained under Rubinstein himself and has been searching for a student worthy of her time. Catherine Wells lowered her camera, her professional instincts recognizing a story that would define her career. Miss Williams, Metropolitan Arts Magazine wants to feature you on our cover. This performance, this moment, the world needs to see it. She glanced meaningfully at Richard, who still stood frozen in the wreckage of his assumptions. And the world needs to understand how close we came to losing you to ignorance. Dr. Vaughn approached with academic urgency, her previous dismissiveness transformed into passionate advocacy. The Foundation must establish an emergency fund for situations exactly like this. How many other children like Zara are practicing on cardboard keyboards while we waste resources on students who already have every advantage? But it was Miranda who provided the most immediate relief. Richard's assistant approached Rosa Williams with quiet dignity, speaking in a voice low enough that only grandmother and granddaughter could hear. Mrs. Williams, Mr. Hartwell's personal account will cover your medical expenses, your rent, and anything else your family needs. This is not charity. This is justice. She pressed an envelope into Rosa's trembling hands. Inside, a check for $50,000 and a letter offering Rosa her job back with a promotion to program coordinator and a salary that would ensure the family never faced eviction again. Rosa's eyes filled with tears as she read. 3 months ago, she had been fired for the audacity of requesting time off for cancer treatment. Now she was being offered dignity, security, and the chance to help other families navigate the system that had nearly destroyed hers. There's more, Miranda continued softly. Mr. Hartwell wants to establish the Billy Williams Memorial Foundation, honoring your grandmother's musical legacy. It will provide instruments, lessons, and scholarships specifically for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the scent of redemption and transformation. Wealthy donors who had arrived expecting a pleasant evening of tax-deductible self-congratulation found themselves witnessing something that would change how they thought about talent, worth, and their own responsibilities to the community. Mrs. Wellington approached with her husband, both of them visibly moved beyond their usual social composure. Young lady, my family foundation would like to endow a music program in Detroit's public schools. Every child deserves the chance to discover what you've shown us tonight. Judge Morrison, his legal mind already working through possibilities, stepped forward with characteristic precision. Miss Williams, if you're interested in pursuing legal action regarding tonight's treatment, or if you need advocacy and educational placement, my firm would be honored to represent you pro bono. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when a group of the catering staff, busboys, waitresses, security guards, formed their own small circle around Zara. These were people who understood struggle intimately, who recognized the courage it had taken to sit at that piano and refuse to be intimidated. You showed them, whispered Maria, a waitress who had been cleaning these events for 15 years. You showed all of them that we matter, too. The local news crews had arrived, drawn by social media buzz and phone calls from guests who understood they had witnessed history. But Maestro Giuliani stepped in as an unofficial guardian, ensuring that Zara's sudden fame wouldn't become overwhelming or exploitative. This young artist needs time to process what's happened, he announced to the gathering reporters. Her talent speaks for itself. What she needs now is space to grow and proper training to develop her extraordinary gifts. Through it all, Richard Hartwell remained largely silent, watching the cascade of opportunities and recognition flowing toward the girl he had tried to humiliate. Each offer, each expression of support, each promise of a better future served as another reminder of how catastrophically wrong he had been. The evening that had begun as another routine fundraiser had become something unprecedented, a complete inversion of power that left Detroit's elite scrambling to align themselves with justice instead of privilege, with talent instead of pedigree, with truth instead of comfortable assumptions. As the formal event wound down and guests began to leave, many stopped to shake Zara's hand, to offer their own small contributions to her future, to promise that her story would be shared and her talent protected. The girl who had entered as an unwanted intruder was leaving as the guest of honor, surrounded by people who finally understood what they had almost lost to their own blindness. But the most important transformation was yet to come. 3 months later, Zara Williams stood on the stage of Carnegie Hall, her fingers poised above another magnificent Steinway. The black concert dress, a gift from Mrs. Wellington, transformed her into the artist she had always been inside. But tonight, she played not as the girl who had shocked Detroit society, but as the scholarship student at the Detroit Music Academy, whose talent had opened doors across the musical world. In the audience sat Rosa, cancer-free and glowing with health that proper medical care had made possible. Beside her, Richard Hartwell watched with tears streaming down his face. A man fundamentally changed by one child's courage to show her true self when everything was at stake. The Billy Williams Memorial Foundation had already placed instruments in 50 Detroit schools. Cardboard keyboards were being replaced with real pianos, real opportunities, real hope. Children who had never imagined touching a quality instrument were discovering gifts they didn't know they possessed. But perhaps the most profound change wasn't in the music programs or scholarship funds or newspaper headlines. It was in the way people looked at each other now, with curiosity instead of judgment, with possibility instead of prejudice, with recognition that extraordinary talent could emerge from the most unexpected places. Zara's story had traveled far beyond Detroit. Videos of her performance had been viewed millions of times across the globe, inspiring countless others who had been told their dreams were too big for their circumstances. Letters poured in from young musicians practicing in poverty, from parents working multiple jobs to support their children's artistic aspirations, from adults who had given up on dreams and were finding courage to try again. Talent doesn't recognize zip codes, bank accounts, or bloodlines, Rosa had said in her speech at the Foundation's inaugural gala. It lives in the most unexpected places, waiting for one brave moment to change everything. The truth was both simpler and more complex than anyone had imagined. Genius didn't require perfect circumstances, it required recognition, opportunity, and the courage to persist when the world said no. Zara's 4 minutes at the piano had proven that greatness existed everywhere, hidden behind assumptions and barriers that could crumble in an instant when confronted with undeniable truth. Tonight, as Chopin's ballad filled Carnegie Hall with the same emotional power that had transformed a Detroit fundraiser, the audience wept for different reasons. Not shock at unexpected talent, but joy at witnessing a gift fully realized, properly nurtured, given the stage it always deserved. When was the last time you looked beyond someone's circumstances to see their potential? What gifts are you hiding because the world told you they're not enough? Who in your life deserves recognition they've never received? Sometimes the people we're quickest to judge are the ones who hold the power to transform our hearts. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the places we least expect to find it. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to really listen, we discover that the difference between us and them was never talent or worth. It was simply opportunity. If Zara's story moved you, subscribe for more incredible true stories of hidden talent conquering impossible odds. Next week, we're sharing how a homeless veteran's poetry changed an entire city council meeting, proving once again that greatness refuses to be silenced by circumstance. Hit that notification bell, because every week we uncover extraordinary people proving that dreams don't need permission to come true.
The story you heard today wasn't cleaned up. It was told exactly as it happened. At Black Voices Uncut, we believe that's the only way truth can live. If you felt something, hit like, comment, and your reaction, and subscribe. Every week, we bring you voices that refuse to be silenced.